The blade was already at her throat before the first alarm even thought about ringing. I felt it before I saw it. A change in the air pressure of the throne chamber, a whisper of fabric too quiet to be one of the palace staff. My body reacted before my mind caught up, the way it always does when something in the room does not belong. I was standing 3 steps behind the queen's seat, where I always stood, hands folded, eyes moving across the room in slow, careful sweeps. Then the shadow behind her chair became a person, and the person became a knife, and the knife became a voice. "Don't move," the voice whispered, in perfect Zeltari, close enough to stir the fine violet hairs along the queen's neck. Queen Sisvaneth froze. Her long fingers, resting on the arms of her throne, went rigid. Her breath caught in that strange double rhythm her people used when afraid, a sound like a held note about to break. Around us, 6 other guards stood at their posts, useless, blind, still scanning doors and windows for a threat that was already standing 4 feet from their monarch's spine. I did not freeze. I did not reach for my weapon. I did not shout a warning that would have gotten her killed in the same breath it left my mouth. I smiled. It was not the smile of a man in control of his fear. It was the smile of a man who had been waiting for this exact moment for 6 days, and was mildly satisfied that it had finally arrived. The assassin's eyes found mine over the queen's shoulder. I watched something shift in them, a flicker of confusion where triumph should have been. She had expected panic. She had expected fumbling guards and a screaming ruler and a clean 2-second window to finish her work and vanish into the dark corridors of the palace the way she had come in. She had not expected a human standing perfectly still, grinning at her like she had just told a joke only he understood. Let me back up, because none of this makes sense without knowing how a man like me ended up standing behind an alien queen with my life resting on the space between one heartbeat and the next. My name is Daniel Cole. Before any of this, I was nothing special by human standards, and human standards, out here among the stars, are already considered strange by everyone else. I grew up on a colony world called Aldrin's Reach, a rust-colored patch of dirt and iron mines 3 jumps from Earth, where the only law that mattered was the law of who got there first and who was willing to fight to keep it. I was not born into privilege. I was born into work, and work made me hard in ways that soft worlds never do. By the time I was 20, I had learned 3 things that would shape the rest of my life. The first was that pain was temporary, but quitting was permanent. The second was that most fights are won before they start, in the moments where you decide exactly how far you are willing to go. The third was that almost every other species in the galaxy operates by rules, unspoken agreements about how violence is supposed to look, how far is too far, when to stop. Humans never got that memo. I did not choose to become a bodyguard for alien royalty. Nobody chooses that path from the beginning. I fell into it the way most humans fall into strange jobs across the galaxy, one contract at a time, each one a little stranger than the last, until one day you look up and realize you are standing in a throne room built for creatures with 3 hearts and violet skin, protecting a queen who rules over a species that has existed for longer than human civilization has had written language. The galaxy is old, older than anything humanity understood when we first stepped past our own solar system. There are empires out here that have risen and fallen a dozen times over, species who fought their first wars while our ancestors were still discovering fire. When humanity finally arrived among the stars, we were the newest, smallest, least significant voice in a very old, very crowded room. Nobody expected much from us. Most of the galaxy's dominant civilizations assumed we would either be conquered quickly or fade quietly into irrelevance, one more small species clinging to the edges of a much larger conversation. They were wrong, and it did not take long for them to figure out why. The truth about humans, the thing that took the rest of the galaxy several painful lessons to understand, is that we do not fight the way anyone else fights. Every other major species out here has some kind of built-in limiter, some ancient instinct or cultural rule that keeps their violence contained within boundaries. The Khastari, the species I now served, had an entire code of honor around combat, rules about announcing your intentions, rules about giving your opponent a chance to yield, rules about not striking in ways considered excessive even in war. Humans do not have those rules. Or rather, we have them, but they are optional, situational, and thrown away the instant survival is on the table. We evolved on a world full of predators bigger and faster and stronger than us, and the only reason we are still here is because somewhere in our distant past, our ancestors decided that fighting fair was a luxury for species that were not fighting to live. That difference, more than our technology, more than our numbers, more than anything else, is why humans started getting hired across the galaxy as bodyguards, security specialists, and in the quiet corners nobody likes to talk about, something closer to enforcers. We were expensive. We were considered unpredictable. Some species refused to hire us at all, viewing our willingness to escalate as barbaric. But the ones who understood what was actually at stake, the rulers and leaders who had survived long enough to know that politeness does not stop a blade, those were the ones who started quietly reaching out to human contractors when their own guards were not enough. That is how I ended up in front of Queen Seveneth 3 years ago, standing in an office that smelled like burning incense and old parchment, listening to her explain, through a translator that kept mispronouncing half her words, that she needed someone who did not care about honor, only about keeping her alive. I remember looking at her for a long moment before answering. She was young for a Xelthari monarch, barely into her 2nd century, which by their standards made her practically a child, wearing a crown too heavy for her shoulders. Her empire was shrinking. Rival factions circled her borders like scavengers, waiting for a wounded animal to finally stop moving. Her own court was full of nobles who smiled at her during the day and plotted against her at night. She did not need another guard who would follow the old rules of engagement, the careful, ceremonial combat that Xelthari warriors trained for their entire lives. She needed someone who would break every rule the moment it became necessary and feel nothing but relief afterward. I told her I could do that. She asked me why she should trust a stranger from a species her people had only known for a handful of years. I told her the truth, because lying to someone about to trust you with their life is a special kind of foolishness. I told her that trust was not something I could prove with words. It was something I could only prove by being the last person standing between her and whoever wanted her dead. She hired me that same day. The first year was quiet, at least by the standards of a dying empire. I learned the palace, learned the guards, learned the nobles who smiled too widely, and the ones who never smiled at all. I learned Sazvaneth herself, discovered that beneath the crown and the ceremony was someone who worried constantly about her people, who spent long nights reading reports about famine in the outer provinces instead of sleeping, who genuinely wanted to be a good ruler in a galaxy that rarely rewarded goodness with survival. I did not expect to respect her. Bodyguard work is often just work, a paycheck attached to a body you are contracted to keep breathing. But somewhere in that first year, respect crept in without my permission, and once it arrived, it never left. The second year was when the first real attempt on her life happened. It came from inside the palace, a noble named Vren who had grown tired of waiting for his ambitions to be recognized through legal channels. He hired outside help, a group of mercenaries from a rival system, men and women trained in the old Xelthari fighting traditions, skilled in the careful, honor-bound style of combat that had ruled this part of the galaxy for centuries. They came at night, through a servant's passage nobody thought to guard heavily, because nobody expected an attack to come from somewhere so undignified. I was waiting for them anyway. What happened in that corridor that night became something the Xelthari court still whispered about a year later, not because of how many attackers there were, though there were 7, not because of how it ended, though it ended quickly and decisively in my favor. It was how it ended that unsettled them. Xelthari combat culture has a concept called the final measure, a moment during serious combat where a fighter who has clearly lost is given a chance to yield, to step back, to end the confrontation without further harm. It is considered deeply dishonorable to deny an opponent that moment once they have visibly submitted. I did not know about the final measure that night, and even if I had known, I would not have cared. I ended the confrontation the way my instincts told me to end it, quickly, thoroughly, without pausing to consider whether my opponents felt they deserved a graceful exit. When S. Vaneth's guards finally arrived, drawn by the noise, they found me standing alone in that corridor, breathing hard, completely unbothered, while 7 trained warriors lay defeated around me. The story spread through the palace within a day. Some of the nobles started calling me the beast from Earth, not entirely as an insult, though not entirely as a compliment either. Others simply started avoiding eye contact with me in the halls, the way people avoid looking directly at something they do not fully understand. So Vaneth asked me privately, a few days later, why I had not allowed any of them the final measure. I told her the truth. I told her that the final measure only makes sense if you believe your opponent will honor the same rules when the situation is reversed. I did not believe that, and I was not willing to bet her life on a tradition built for a galaxy that had never met anyone like me. She was quiet for a long time after I said that. Then she told me something I never forgot. She said that for the first time since becoming queen, she finally understood why so many of her rivals had started fearing a species most of the galaxy still considered small and unremarkable. It was not our technology. It was not our numbers. It was the fact that we simply refused to lose. That reputation followed me through the following year, growing quietly in the shadows of galactic politics the way reputations tend to grow, through whispered stories told in the private chambers of nobles and the guarded conversations of rival monarchs. Word travels fast among people who spend their lives worrying about assassination, and the story of the human bodyguard who broke the final measure without hesitation eventually reached ears far beyond Sylvaneth's palace. It reached, eventually, the ears of someone who made a living, removing inconvenient rulers from power. The Shelthari called her people the Void Reapers, an old and quiet order of assassins who did not belong to any single empire, who took contracts from whoever paid enough and asked few questions about why. They were considered the deadliest individual fighters in this entire region of the galaxy, trained from childhood in techniques designed specifically to counter the instincts and reflexes of nearly every major species known to exist. Nearly every species, not humans. There simply had not been enough of us out here long enough for anyone, even the Void Reapers, to build a proper understanding of how we actually fought. I learned about the contract on Mrs. Vaneth's life 6 days before the assassin appeared in the throne room. Intelligence reached the palace through one of the few nobles who remained loyal, a quiet, careful woman named Elira, who had spent years cultivating informants across the rival factions, circling Sisvaneth's throne. She came to me directly rather than the queen, because she trusted my judgment more than she trusted the palace's ceremonial security procedures. A Void Reaper had been hired. The price paid for the contract was staggering, enough to suggest that whoever wanted Mrs. Vaneth dead considered the expense worthwhile, regardless of cost. The assassin's identity was unknown. Her method was unknown. The only certainty was the timeline, an unspecified window within the next several days, and the target, the queen herself. I remember standing in Elira's private study that evening, listening to her explain everything she knew, watching her hands tremble slightly around a cup of untouched tea. She asked me if I was afraid. I told her the truth. I was not afraid of the Void Reaper. I was afraid of what would happen to this fragile, struggling empire if Sisvaneth died before she had the chance to finish the work she had spent years trying to build. That fear, unlike fear for my own safety, was the kind that actually mattered. Over the following days, I did not tell Sisvaneth everything Elira had shared. I told her enough to be careful, enough to adjust her schedule and limit her public appearances, but I did not tell her the full weight of what was coming, because I needed her calm, not terrified. Terrified rulers make mistakes. Calm ones survive. Instead, I spent those 6 days doing something the palace guards never noticed, something that would matter far more than any additional patrol or extra lock on a door. I studied everything available about how Void Reapers operated, their preferred entry points, their patience, their reputation for waiting inside a target's own security for days, sometimes weeks, before finally striking at the exact moment their target felt safest. And I began, quietly, deliberately, to build a version of safety that was not actually safety at all. I wanted the assassin to believe she had found weakness. I wanted her to grow confident, comfortable, certain that the human guard everyone whispered about was simply another obstacle she had already accounted for. I wanted her to walk directly into a trap she believed she had built herself. The night it finally happened started like every other night that week. Svaneth sat in her private throne chamber, reviewing reports from the outer provinces long after the rest of the court had retired. The other guards stood their usual posts near the doors and windows, eyes scanning the entry points, following procedures built around centuries of Zelthari tradition. None of them were watching the space directly behind the throne, because no Zelthari assassin in living memory had ever managed to breach that space undetected. It was considered impossible, protected by wards, sensors, and the simple fact that no known technique allowed someone to approach from that angle without triggering an alarm. I had spent 6 days quietly disabling exactly enough of those safeguards to make it seem possible, without making it seem intentional. I had studied the layout until I understood every blind spot, every shadow, every moment where a truly skilled infiltrator might convince herself she had found a gap nobody else had noticed. I did not disable those safeguards because I was careless. I disabled them because I wanted her to come through that exact gap, at that exact angle, directly into the one place in the entire chamber where I was always standing close enough to react before anyone else even registered a threat. When the shadow finally moved behind the throne, when the blade finally touched the delicate skin of Svaneth's throat, when the whispered words "don't move" finally broke the silence of that room, I felt something settle inside me that was almost relief. She had come. The trap I had spent 6 days building had finally closed around her, and she did not even realize it yet. I looked at her over the Queen's shoulder, at the confusion beginning to bloom in her eyes as she registered my expression, and I let the smile widen just slightly further. Because in that moment, the Void Reaper believed she held all the power in that room. She had no idea that every single choice she believed she had made freely over the past 6 days, every gap she believed she had discovered, every moment of confidence that had led her to this exact position, had actually been placed there for her, one careful step at a time, by the human she was about to seriously underestimate. The whisper faded into silence. The throne room held its breath, and somewhere behind that calm, unreadable grin on my face, the countdown I had been running since the very first day I heard her name finally reached 0. The assassin's blade rested against Svaneth's throat, but her eyes stayed locked on me. I understood why. In her mind, the equation of this moment was simple: a queen frozen in fear, a blade close enough to end a life in half a second, and a single guard, standing several feet away, who should have been reaching for a weapon, shouting an alarm, doing anything except smiling, like he had already won something she did not yet know she had lost. I want to explain, clearly and honestly, exactly why I was not afraid in that moment, because the reasons matter more than the moment itself. Every species in this galaxy that has survived long enough to build empires has also built assumptions about how danger works. Those assumptions are not flaws. They are survival tools, shaped by millions of years of evolution on their home worlds, refined further by centuries of warfare and diplomacy between the stars. The Zelthari assumed danger announced itself, that true threats moved with purpose and confidence, that hesitation was a sign of weakness rather than patience. The Void Reapers, trained specifically to exploit those assumptions across a dozen different species, had built an entire discipline around striking in the exact moment their targets believed themselves safest. But every one of those assumptions had been built around species that had lived among the stars for a very long time. None of them had been built with humans in mind, because humans were new, small, and until recently, considered irrelevant enough to ignore. That gap, the space between what the galaxy assumed about danger and what humans actually were, had become the single greatest advantage my species carried into every conflict we entered. It was not a fair advantage. Fairness was never the point. Survival was the point, and survival does not care about fairness. I had learned this lesson long before I ever stood in Svaneth's throne room. I learned it on Aldrin's Reach, in the mining tunnels where the older workers taught younger ones that the fights you win are rarely the fights that look impressive from the outside. They are the fights you have already finished, in your own mind, long before your opponent even realizes a fight has begun. That is exactly what I had done over the past 6 days. While the Void Reaper studied the palace, learning its patterns, searching for weakness, I had been studying her in return, using every fragment of information Elira's network could gather. I did not know her face, I did not know her name, but I knew her method, because her method was the same method every Void Reaper used, refined over centuries into something almost mechanical in its precision, patience, observation, the slow construction of an opportunity that would eventually seem to appear on its own, natural and unforced, exactly the kind of opening a trained eye would trust. I had given her that opening deliberately, because I understood something she did not yet realize about herself. Skilled predators, when finally offered exactly the opportunity they have been hunting for, rarely stop to question why the opportunity appeared so cleanly. They see the gap, they see the path forward, and their training tells them to move before doubt has time to catch up. She had moved. She had found her way behind the throne exactly as I expected, exactly when I expected, and now she stood there believing herself in complete control of a situation I had spent 6 days quietly shaping around her. The blade was still steady against Sisvaneth's throat. I could see the tension in the assassin's arm, the careful discipline of someone who had done this before and knew precisely how much pressure to apply without crossing the line into an actual cut, at least not yet. She was not here to kill immediately. She was here to demonstrate control first, to make her target understand completely how helpless she was, before deciding whether death would come quickly or slowly. That detail told me almost everything I needed to know about her training. She wanted a moment of acknowledgement. She wanted the Queen, and likely me as well, to fully register the depth of the failure that had allowed her this close. Void Reapers were known for that particular cruelty, the desire to make their targets understand exactly how thoroughly they had been outmaneuvered before ending the confrontation. It was, ironically, the same instinct that was about to cost her everything, because every second she spent waiting for acknowledgement, waiting for fear to properly register on my face, was another second I used to finish closing the trap I had built around her. Svaneth's breath came in short, controlled bursts. I could see her trying to remain calm, trying to remember whatever training a monarch receives for moments like this, though I doubted any Zelthari education truly prepared a ruler for a blade pressed directly against their throat. Her eyes flicked toward me, silently pleading for understanding, for some sign that I had a plan. I gave her the smallest possible nod, barely a motion at all, just enough for her to feel it, rather than see it. The assassin noticed the exchange immediately. Her eyes narrowed. "You find this amusing," she said quietly, still in perfect Zeltari, her attention shifting fully onto me now, a guard who smiles while his queen's life hangs from a single motion of my hand. I let a moment of silence stretch before answering, because silence, used correctly, can say more than words ever could. "I find it interesting," I finally said, keeping my voice level, almost conversational, "that you believe you found this position on your own." Something flickered across her expression, quick and controlled, but I caught it anyway. Doubt, the first real crack in the calm certainty she had carried into this room. "Every gap in this palace's defenses over the last 6 days," I continued, "every blind spot you discovered, every shift in patrol timing you noticed, every moment you believed you had outsmarted an entire security detail built around a monarch who has survived multiple previous attempts on her life. None of that was luck. None of that was your skill uncovering weakness that already existed." Her jaw tightened, though the blade at Svaneth's throat did not waver, a testament to her discipline even in the face of growing uncertainty. "I built every single one of those gaps myself," I said, "piece by piece, day by day. I built them because I wanted you exactly where you are standing right now." The silence that followed was different from the silence before. It carried weight now, the particular heaviness of someone recalculating everything they believed to be true about a situation they thought they fully understood. "You are lying," she said, though the certainty in her voice had thinned considerably. "Think about it honestly," I said. "A Void Reaper of your reputation, hired for a contract this valuable, moving through a palace guarded by a security detail that includes a human specifically brought in because previous guards failed. Do you truly believe every gap you found over 6 days was simply overlooked by accident? I watched her mind working behind her eyes, running back through every step of her approach, searching for the moment where her assumptions had been quietly guided rather than discovered, the particular corridor she had used to bypass the outer wards. The timing window in the patrol rotation that had conveniently existed exactly when she needed it. The single blind spot behind the throne that should have been the most heavily protected space in the entire chamber, yet somehow was not. Every piece of it had been placed there for her, carefully, deliberately, over 6 patient days. Why, she finally asked, and for the first time, there was something almost like genuine curiosity beneath the controlled menace of her voice. Would you build a path directly to your own queen's throat? Because you were coming regardless, I said simply. The only question was whether you arrived at a place and moment I understood, or a place and moment I did not. I chose to guarantee the first option. Behind her, though she could not see it from her angle, Sisvaneth's eyes had begun to shift from raw terror into something closer to careful understanding. She had trusted me for 3 years. She had watched me handle threats before that others considered impossible to survive. Something in her expression told me she was beginning to trust that trust again, even with a blade resting against her own throat. The assassin's grip on her weapon tightened slightly, a subtle shift I noticed immediately. She was recalculating her options, running through the same mental process any highly trained fighter runs through when a situation stops matching their expectations. Should she finish the task immediately, accepting whatever consequence followed? Should she attempt to use the queen as leverage to secure an exit? Should she reconsider the entire confrontation from a completely different angle? I needed her hesitating in exactly this way. Every second of recalculation was a second closer to the moment I had been preparing for since the very beginning of this 6-day performance. You should know one more thing, I said quietly, letting the words settle into the space between us before continuing. The final measure that your training likely respects, the tradition of allowing a defeated opponent one chance to yield before the confrontation ends completely. I do not follow that tradition. I never have. Every previous attempt on this queen's life ended the same way, regardless of how skilled or dangerous the attacker believed themselves to be. Her eyes met mine fully now, and for the briefest moment, I saw something that rarely appeared in the eyes of a Void Reaper. Genuine uncertainty about whether she still held the advantage she believed she carried into this room. There is a difference, I continued, between a threat that follows rules you understand and a threat that only follows the rule of finishing what it starts. You have spent your entire career learning to counter the first kind. I am not entirely certain you have ever faced the second. The blade at Sisvaneth's throat trembled, just slightly, the first true break in the assassin's otherwise perfect control. I did not move yet. Not because I was uncertain, but because timing, more than strength or speed, was the single most important weapon I carried into that room. Every second she spent doubting herself was a second she was no longer thinking clearly about her next action, and a predator who stops thinking clearly is no longer a predator at all. She was standing exactly where I needed her to stand. She was thinking exactly what I needed her to think, and somewhere behind my calm, steady expression, the final piece of the trap I had spent 6 patient days building was finally ready to close completely around her. Last chance, I said quietly, my voice carrying none of the aggression she likely expected, only calm, unshakable certainty. Step back from the throne, lower the blade. We can end this conversation without anyone needing to test exactly how far I am willing to go to protect the person sitting in that chair. For a long, suspended moment, nobody in that chamber moved. Sisvaneth's breath remained shallow and controlled. The other guards near the doors, still unaware of exactly how close their queen had come to death, stood frozen in confused uncertainty, sensing tension in the room but unable to identify its source. And between the assassin and me, a silent negotiation played out entirely through posture, breathing, and the particular stillness that exists only in the seconds before violence either erupts or fades away. She made her choice. I watched it happen in the subtle shift of her weight, the almost imperceptible tightening of muscles preparing to act rather than retreat. She had decided to finish what she started. I had been counting on exactly that decision since the very first day I began building this trap around her, because it meant the confrontation was about to happen entirely on terms I had already prepared for, in a space I had already mastered, against an opponent who still believed, even now, that she understood the true shape of the danger standing in front of her. She did not understand it yet, but she was about to. The moment she decided to move, I was already moving too, but not in the direction she expected. Instead of lunging forward to grab her arm, the obvious response, the response any trained Zelthari guard would have chosen, I stepped sideways and slightly back, pulling her attention away from the throne itself. It was a small shift, barely half a step, but it was enough to force her to choose between finishing her task immediately or adjusting to account for my new position. She chose to adjust, exactly as I hoped she would. That single moment of hesitation, the fraction of a second where her focus split between the Queen and me, was the only opening I needed. I closed the distance between us faster than her training had prepared her to expect from a human, using a low, controlled approach that kept my center of gravity beneath hers the entire time. My hand found her wrist before the blade could complete its motion, redirecting the pressure away from Sesvaneth's throat and toward empty air instead. The Queen gasped and pulled back from her throne, scrambling away with a speed I had never seen from her before, driven by pure survival instinct rather than any trained response. That was fine, that was expected. My focus was no longer on protecting her position specifically, because the moment the blade left her throat, the true danger in that room had already been neutralized. Everything after that point was simply about finishing the confrontation without anyone else getting hurt. The assassin recovered quickly, faster than most opponents I had faced before. She twisted out of my grip with a fluid motion that spoke of decades of training, using the momentum of my own grab against me in an attempt to throw me off balance. It nearly worked. I felt my footing slip for half a second, and in that half second, she created enough distance to reset into a proper combat stance. For the first time since the confrontation began, I saw real focus in her eyes, instead of calculated control. She understood now, fully and completely, that the situation had shifted beneath her. The prey she had come to collect had somehow transformed into something else entirely, something that did not match any profile her training had prepared her to counter. "You move strangely," she said, circling slightly, testing the space between us with careful, measured steps. "Nothing like the reports described." "Reports written by people who never actually saw me fight," I said, matching her movement, keeping my weight balanced and ready. "Only people who survived long enough to describe what they thought they saw, filtered through fear and confusion afterward." She lunged again, testing a different angle this time, a quick strike aimed at disabling my arm rather than causing lasting harm. Even now, even mid-confrontation, her training clung to a certain restraint, a habit built around targets who were expected to eventually yield if given the proper opportunity. I did not give her that opportunity, because I understood something about this fight that she had not yet accepted. This was never going to end with a clean, honorable resolution, the way her training expected. It was going to end when one of us simply stopped being able to continue, and I had spent my entire life ensuring that person would never be me. I absorbed the strike rather than avoiding it completely, accepting a moment of discomfort in exchange for closing the distance between us again. It was a trade her training likely never considered reasonable, deliberately accepting a hit in order to gain positioning. Zelthari combat philosophy, like most philosophies built around honorable engagement, assumed that avoiding damage was always the correct priority. Mine did not. I used the brief contact to secure a firm hold on her weapon arm, redirecting her momentum into a controlled fall that brought her down onto the polished stone floor of the throne room. She twisted immediately, attempting to regain her footing, but I had already shifted my weight to pin the critical points of leverage, the shoulder, the wrist, the angle of her elbow that determined whether her arm could generate any further force. She struggled against the hold for several long seconds, testing different angles, searching for any weakness in my positioning. I felt the exact moment she realized there was none to find. Her body went still beneath mine, not in surrender, but in the particular stillness of someone recalculating an entire strategy from the ground up. "You could have killed me already," she said quietly, her voice carrying a strange mixture of confusion and something almost like respect. "Twice now, by my count. Why do you hesitate?" I considered the question for a moment before answering, because it deserved an honest answer rather than a quick one. "Because a dead assassin tells me nothing," I said. "A living one, properly motivated, might tell me who paid for this contract, and why, and how many more of you are already planning the next attempt after this one fails." Her eyes narrowed, though the fight had largely drained from her posture now, replaced by careful, focused thought. "You intend to interrogate me." "I intend to have a conversation," I said. "Whether that conversation stays pleasant is entirely up to you." Behind us, the other guards had finally registered the disturbance, rushing forward with weapons drawn, shouting commands that meant little in the chaos of the moment. I called out for them to hold their positions, keeping my voice steady and commanding enough that they actually listened, a small miracle, given how thoroughly the situation had unfolded outside their usual procedures. Sifmaneth, still catching her breath near the far wall of the chamber, watched the entire scene with an expression I had never seen on her face before, somewhere between shock, relief, and the beginning of a much deeper understanding about exactly what she had hired 3 years earlier when she brought a human into her personal guard. The assassin remained still beneath my hold, no longer struggling, her breathing slow and controlled despite the position she found herself in. I recognized the discipline in that stillness, the same discipline that had allowed her to remain patient through 6 days of careful infiltration, waiting for a moment that never actually belonged to her. "You built this entire situation," she said finally, not as a question this time, but as a statement she had fully accepted. "Every gap, every opportunity, all of it, deliberately constructed. Every piece," I confirmed. "Why go through such effort," she asked, "when a simple increase in security would have accomplished the same result, keeping me from ever reaching this room at all?" It was a fair question, and one I had already considered carefully before deciding on this approach. "Because turning you away tonight only delays the problem," I said. "You would have returned eventually, perhaps with better information, perhaps with a different approach entirely. I needed this to end completely, not temporarily. And ending it completely required understanding exactly who sent you, and exactly how deep this threat actually runs." She was quiet for a long moment, processing that reasoning with the same careful analysis she likely applied to every decision in her profession. Then, slowly, deliberately, she allowed her body to relax fully beneath my hold, a clear and unmistakable signal of surrender rather than another attempt at deception. "Then, let us have this conversation," she said, "though I doubt you will enjoy everything I have to share." I did not release my hold immediately, because trust, even earned trust, still required verification before action, but something in her tone told me that the true danger of this encounter had finally passed, replaced by something far more valuable than a simple neutralized threat. Information, answers, the first real thread leading toward whoever had decided that Savaneth's death was worth this level of expense and risk. Savaneth finally approached, her steps slow and careful, still visibly shaken but steadier now than she had been moments earlier. She looked down at the assassin held beneath my careful control, then up at me, her expression unreadable for several long seconds. "You knew," she said quietly. "You knew this entire time, and you said nothing." "I told you enough to be careful," I said. "I did not tell you everything, because I needed you calm enough to continue functioning as queen while I prepared for this moment. Fear clouds judgment. I could not afford your judgment being clouded while I built the only trap capable of ending this threat completely." She absorbed that explanation slowly, her earlier fear beginning to shift into something more complicated, a mixture of gratitude and a deeper, more unsettling realization about exactly how far I had been willing to go, and exactly how much I had been willing to risk in order to protect her. 3 years, she said finally, almost to herself. 3 years, and I am only now beginning to understand what I actually hired. I did not respond to that immediately, because there was nothing to say that would not sound either falsely modest or uncomfortably honest. Instead, I focused on the assassin beneath me, on the conversation that still needed to happen, on the deeper threads of this conspiracy that remained unraveled. The immediate danger had passed, but the true nightmare, the one hinted at in every rumor and whispered warning that had reached this palace over the past 6 days, was only just beginning to reveal its true shape. We moved the conversation to a private chamber deep beneath the palace, a room normally reserved for sensitive diplomatic discussions rather than interrogations, but one that offered the privacy this situation required. I did not want word of tonight's events spreading through the court before I understood the full scope of what we were dealing with. Rumors, in a palace already thick with political tension, could be almost as dangerous as the assassin herself. The Void Reaper sat across from me at a plain stone table, her hands secured but not painfully so, her posture calm despite her circumstances. Svaneth stood near the door, watching silently, having insisted on being present, despite my gentle suggestion that she might prefer to rest after everything she had experienced. She had refused, and I understood why. A ruler who hides from difficult conversations after surviving an assassination attempt sends the wrong message to everyone around her, including herself. "Let us begin with something simple," I said, keeping my tone even, neither hostile nor overly friendly. "Your name?" She studied me for a long moment before answering. "Vesh," she said finally. "Though names mean little in my profession, we are trained to be forgotten as quickly as we are hired." "Vesh, then," I said. "Who hired you?" She was quiet again, longer this time, clearly weighing the value of loyalty to a client against the reality of her current situation. Void Reapers were known throughout the galaxy for a reputation of discretion, a professional code that discouraged revealing employers even under pressure. But I suspected, correctly as it turned out, that Vesh's loyalty had limits, particularly when the job itself had failed so completely. "The contract came through several intermediaries," she said finally. "Standard practice, meant to protect both parties from exposure. I do not know the original source with absolute certainty, but the payment structure, the scale of resources involved, the specific timeline demanded, all of it pointed towards someone with significant standing among the rival factions along your southern border." Svaneth's expression tightened at that description. I glanced toward her briefly before returning my attention to Vesh. "Give me a name," I said. "Even a guess, based on everything you observed during the arrangement." Vesh considered the question carefully. "House Thren," she said finally. "Their emissary handled the final negotiations. He was careful, professional, clearly experienced in arranging matters that required deniability. But he made one mistake that suggested exactly who he represented." "What mistake?" Sveneth asked, speaking for the first time since we had entered the chamber, her voice steadier now than I expected. He asked, near the end of our negotiations, whether I could ensure the death appeared to result from internal palace conflict rather than external interference. Vesh said, "A request like that only makes sense if the party responsible has something specific to gain from your court, believing the danger came from within rather than from beyond your borders." I felt something settle into place as she spoke, connecting pieces of political tension I had noticed building for months without fully understanding their source. House Thren had been quietly expanding their influence along the southern trade routes for the past year, always through careful diplomatic channels, always maintaining plausible deniability about their ambitions. If Svaneth died and the blame fell on internal conspiracy rather than external interference, it would create exactly the kind of instability House Thren could exploit, positioning themselves as a stabilizing force while the Empire's other factions turned against each other in suspicion and paranoia. "This goes deeper than a single assassination attempt," I said quietly, mostly to myself, though both Svaneth and Vesh heard the observation clearly. "It always does," Vesh said, something almost like weary understanding in her voice. "Contracts like mine are rarely about a single death. They exist to reshape entire systems of power, using one carefully placed action to trigger consequences far beyond the immediate target. Svaneth stepped closer to the table, her earlier fear now fully transformed into something harder, more focused. How many others, she asked, have been given similar contracts against my court? Not against me specifically, but against my allies, my advisors, the nobles who remain loyal despite the pressure surrounding them. Vesh hesitated before answering, clearly weighing how much additional information she was willing to provide. I do not know specifics, she said eventually, but contracts of this scale rarely exist in isolation. If House Thren was willing to invest this heavily in your death, it is reasonable to assume similar arrangements exist elsewhere within your court, targeting anyone who might resist the transition of power they are attempting to engineer. The room fell silent for a long moment as the full weight of that information settled over us. This had never been a simple assassination attempt. It was a single visible piece of a much larger, much more carefully constructed conspiracy, one that had likely been developing quietly for months, possibly longer, waiting for the right moment to fully unfold. I need names, I said, turning my attention back to Vesh. Every contact you had during these negotiations, every detail about how payment was structured, how communication was routed, anything that might help identify others who could be caught in similar arrangements. Vesh studied me for a long moment, something shifting behind her calm expression. You intend to use this information to protect her court entirely, she said, not quite a question. Not simply to punish those responsible for tonight, but to prevent whatever comes next. That has always been the goal, I said simply. She was quiet again, considering something carefully before finally speaking. I have never encountered a guard who thought this far beyond the immediate threat in front of him, she said. Most targets, and most protectors, focus entirely on surviving today. You have spent 6 days constructing a trap I never saw coming, and now, within moments of that trap succeeding, you are already working to dismantle threats that have not yet fully revealed themselves. Survival today means nothing if it only delays the same danger until tomorrow, I said. I learned that lesson a long time ago, in circumstances very different from this palace, but the principle remains the same regardless of where you learn it. Vesh nodded slowly, something in her posture shifting toward genuine cooperation rather than reluctant compliance. Over the following hour, she provided every detail she could recall about the arrangement, names of intermediaries, patterns of communication, financial structures that Illyra's network would need weeks to fully trace, but which gave us an immediate foundation to begin protecting the court's most vulnerable members. By the time the conversation concluded, Svaneth had grown noticeably quieter, absorbing the scale of the conspiracy that had been building around her without her full awareness. I recognized that particular silence. It was the silence of someone recalculating everything they believed to be true about the stability of their own throne. This is larger than I understood, she said finally, once Vesh had been escorted away under careful guard, her earlier hostility replaced by a strange, cautious respect that neither of us fully acknowledged aloud. It usually is, I said. Threats rarely arrive as single, isolated events. They arrive as pieces of something much larger, and the real danger is never the piece you can see. It is the pieces still hidden, waiting for their moment. Svaneth turned to face me fully, her expression carrying a weight I had not seen from her before. Not fear exactly, but something closer to genuine reckoning. 3 years ago, she said, I hired you because I needed someone who did not follow the same rules as everyone else around me. I understood that decision intellectually. I do not think I truly understood it until tonight. What changed? I asked. Tonight, I watched you build an entire trap around one of the most dangerous individuals in this region of the galaxy, using nothing but patience, careful observation, and complete disregard for the traditions everyone else in this palace treats as unbreakable, she said. You did not defeat her through strength alone. You defeated her by understanding, more completely than she understood herself, exactly how she thought. I did not respond immediately, because there was truth in her observation that did not require additional commentary. Instead, I simply nodded, acknowledging what she had said without embellishing it further. There will be more attempts, Svaneth said quietly, her gaze drifting toward the door where Vesh had been led away moments earlier. House Thren will not simply accept tonight's failure and abandon their ambitions. If anything, they will grow more careful, more determined, searching for whatever gap they believe still exists in my defenses. They will search, I agreed. But they will be searching for a gap built around the assumption that protecting you means following the same traditions and expectations every other guard in this galaxy follows. That assumption has already failed once tonight. It will continue failing as long as I remain the one standing behind your throne. She studied me for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind her eyes. You say that with remarkable confidence, she said, for someone who has just survived an encounter with one of the deadliest individuals in this region of space. Confidence is not the same as certainty, I said. I am not certain nothing will ever threaten you again. I am confident that whatever comes next will be met with the same patience, the same preparation, and the same complete disregard for whatever rules the next threat assumes I will follow. For the first time since the confrontation had begun, Sisvaneth allowed herself something close to a genuine smile, small and tired, but real. The beast from Earth, she said quietly, recalling the nickname the court had given me after that first encounter years earlier. I think I finally understand why that name spread so quickly. It is not entirely accurate, I said. Beasts act on instinct alone. Everything that happened tonight required 6 days of careful, deliberate planning. Perhaps, she said, but I suspect the instinct beneath that planning is exactly what makes you capable of building traps like this one in the first place. I did not argue the point further, because there was likely truth in what she said. Instinct and planning were never truly separate things, not for me, not for any human who had learned early in life that survival depended on both working together rather than existing as opposing forces. The immediate crisis had passed, but as we stood together in that quiet chamber beneath the palace, both of us understood that tonight's events had only revealed the smallest visible edge of something far larger, something that would require far more than a single successful defense to fully resolve. Word of the failed assassination attempt could not stay contained forever, no matter how carefully we tried to manage it. Palaces are strange places, built on the illusion of privacy, while actually functioning as some of the most efficient rumor engines in the known galaxy. By the following morning, whispers had already begun moving through the corridors, carried by servants who had noticed unusual activity near the throne room, by guards who had been present but not fully informed, by nobles whose informants moved faster than any official announcement ever could. I stood beside Sisvaneth during the morning court session, watching the reactions ripple across the gathered nobles as fragments of the previous night's events reached them in incomplete, distorted pieces. Some had heard that an assassin had breached the palace entirely. Others believed the attempt had been stopped before it truly began. A few, closer to the truth than they realized, whispered about a Void Reaper caught alive, an almost unheard-of outcome, given the Order's legendary reputation for either succeeding completely or disappearing without a trace. Illyra approached me quietly during a brief recess, her expression carefully neutral despite the tension visible in her posture. "The court is unsettled," she said, keeping her voice low enough that only I could hear. "Some believe you saved her through simple luck. Others believe something more deliberate happened, though none of them fully understand what. Let them believe whatever keeps them cautious," I said. "The truth will emerge eventually, but for now, uncertainty serves us better than clarity." "And House Thren?" she asked, watching my expression carefully. "They will hear about tonight's failure soon enough," I said. "The question is, how they respond once they understand their carefully constructed plan has completely collapsed." Illyra nodded slowly, understanding the implications without needing further explanation. Over the following days, her network began the careful work of tracing every thread Vesh had provided, following financial records, communication patterns, and diplomatic movements that painted an increasingly clear picture of exactly how deep House Thren's ambitions actually ran. What emerged over the following week was more troubling than even Sisvaneth had initially feared. House Thren had not simply commissioned a single assassination attempt against the Queen. They had spent the better part of a year cultivating relationships with several disaffected nobles within Sisvaneth's own court, offering promises of favorable treatment and expanded influence in exchange for quiet cooperation once the Queen's death created the political vacuum they were counting on. 3 separate nobles were eventually identified as having accepted some form of arrangement with House Thren's representatives, though the extent of their cooperation varied considerably. 1, a minor administrator named Corvin, had simply agreed to delay reporting certain security concerns in exchange for a promised position within whatever government eventually replaced Esesvaneth's rule. Another, a more senior figure within the military command structure, had gone further, quietly redirecting resources away from the palace's outer defenses during the exact window when Vesh had made her approach. Discovering these connections took careful, patient work, exactly the kind of work that could not be rushed without risking exposure before the full picture had been mapped. I spent those days continuing my normal duties as Esesvaneth's guard, maintaining the appearance that life within the palace had returned to normal, while quietly coordinating with Illyra's network to ensure each new piece of evidence was properly verified before any action was taken. Sisvaneth herself grew visibly more cautious during this period, though not in the way fear typically manifests. Her caution sharpened rather than paralyzed her, transforming into a kind of careful, deliberate leadership that I had not fully seen from her before the assassination attempt. She began reviewing every decision made within her court with fresh scrutiny, questioning assumptions she had previously accepted without hesitation, rebuilding her understanding of who around her could truly be trusted. "I used to believe loyalty was something earned through years of service," she told me one evening, as we walked together through the palace gardens, a rare moment of relative privacy, away from the constant presence of court observers. "Now I understand that loyalty can erode slowly, quietly, without any single dramatic betrayal marking the moment it disappeared." "Loyalty is not a fixed thing," I said. "It shifts based on circumstances, pressure, and opportunity. The nobles who betrayed you were not necessarily disloyal from the beginning. They simply reached a point where the promises offered by House Thren outweighed whatever loyalty they once held toward your throne." "That is not a comforting thought," she said. "It is not meant to be comforting," I said. "It is meant to be accurate." Comfort rarely helps a ruler make the decisions necessary to protect what matters most. She was quiet for a long moment, considering that observation carefully before responding. "You speak sometimes like someone who has thought about these questions far longer than 3 years of service would explain," she said. I did not answer immediately, because the honest answer required acknowledging parts of my past I rarely discussed openly, even with someone I had come to trust as deeply as Esesvaneth. Eventually, I decided the moment called for honesty rather than deflection. "Before I ever left Aldrin's reach," I said, "I watched loyalty shift and dissolve more times than I could count, among people who had known each other their entire lives. Resources were scarce. Survival demanded difficult choices. I learned early that trust is never permanent, only earned and re-earned constantly, through actions rather than promises." Svaneth absorbed that explanation quietly, something in her expression softening slightly, perhaps recognizing a version of hardship that echoed, in different form, the struggles her own empire currently faced. "Perhaps that is exactly why you were able to build the trap that saved my life," she said finally. "You understand, more clearly than most who serve me, exactly how easily circumstances can turn even loyal people toward betrayal, and exactly how to build defenses around that reality, rather than pretending it does not exist." Over the following 2 weeks, the 3 compromised nobles were quietly removed from their positions, each situation handled differently based on the severity of their involvement. Corvin, whose cooperation had been minimal and largely passive, was reassigned to a distant administrative post, far from the palace, a quiet consequence that avoided public scandal while still removing him from any position of continued influence. The more senior military figure faced harsher consequences, formally stripped of his command and placed under careful monitoring while the full extent of his cooperation with House Thren continued to be investigated. House Thren itself, upon realizing that their carefully constructed plan had not only failed, but had been thoroughly unraveled, responded exactly as Illyra's network predicted they would. They issued careful, diplomatically worded denials, distancing themselves from any connection to the assassination attempt, while simultaneously working through back channels to determine exactly how much evidence Svaneth's court actually possessed against them. I remained close to Svaneth throughout this delicate period, aware that House Thren's leadership would be carefully weighing their next move, deciding whether to escalate their ambitions further or retreat quietly, while they still maintained plausible deniability. Rulers who commission failed assassination attempts rarely simply give up their original goals. They adapt, reconsider, and often return with a different approach entirely. What happens now? Svaneth asked me one evening, as reports continued arriving detailing House Thren's careful diplomatic maneuvering in the aftermath of their failed plan, if they attempt something else entirely. Not another assassin, but something more indirect, an economic pressure campaign, or an attempt to destabilize my remaining alliances. Then we adapt as well, I said. The advantage I hold is not limited to physical confrontation. It extends to patience, observation, and a willingness to think several steps beyond whatever the immediate threat presents. Whatever form their next attempt takes, we will meet it with the same preparation that ended their first attempt so completely. She studied me for a long moment, something like genuine confidence beginning to settle into her expression, replacing the raw uncertainty that had lingered since the night of the attack. 3 years ago, she said, I hired a bodyguard because I needed someone willing to break rules others considered unbreakable. I did not fully understand, until recent weeks, exactly how valuable that willingness would become. Rules exist for a reason, I said, but rules built for one kind of danger rarely account for every danger that eventually arrives. Sometimes protecting what matters most requires understanding exactly which rules can be safely broken and which cannot. News of the failed assassination attempt, despite our best efforts at containment, eventually spread beyond Svaneth's court entirely, reaching neighboring systems and rival factions who had been quietly watching her reign for any sign of weakness. The story that emerged, shaped by rumor and exaggeration as such stories always are, painted a picture that unsettled far more than House Thren's leadership alone. A Void Reaper, one of the deadliest individual operatives in the entire region, had been captured alive rather than killed, or successfully completing her contract. The circumstances surrounding her capture, though incomplete in most versions of the story, consistently included one detail that spread faster than any other. The Queen's human guard had not simply defended against the attack. He had anticipated it, prepared for it, and deliberately constructed the exact circumstances of its failure days before it ever occurred. That detail, more than any other aspect of the story, began shifting how other rulers across the region viewed the growing presence of human contractors within their own security arrangements. Across the wider galaxy, information moves at different speeds, depending on who is listening and why. Among common citizens, the story of a failed assassination attempt against a relatively minor regional queen barely registered as noteworthy news. But among the specific circles that mattered most, the rulers, the intelligence networks, the professional guards and mercenaries who made their living protecting powerful individuals from exactly this kind of threat, the details of that night spread with remarkable speed and precision. I learned, through Illyra's continued monitoring of galactic communication channels, that at least 4 other regional monarchs had specifically inquired about hiring human contractors within the 2 weeks following the incident. Some of these inquiries came from rulers who had previously dismissed human guards as an unnecessary novelty, a strange curiosity rather than a serious security consideration. Others came from monarchs who had already employed human contractors in minor roles, but were now considering expanding those arrangements significantly. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. Humanity's reputation across this region of the galaxy had been built slowly, contract by contract, incident by incident, over several years since our first meaningful contact with the wider community of civilizations. But the story emerging from Svaneth's court represented something different from previous incidents. It was not simply a demonstration of human resilience or unconventional combat effectiveness. It was a demonstration of something the galaxy's traditional intelligence and security services had not fully anticipated, a willingness to think several steps beyond the immediate moment. to build elaborate, patient strategies that exploited an opponent's own confidence against them. "You have become something of a legend," Illyra told me one afternoon, reviewing reports gathered from her network's contacts across several neighboring systems. "Not simply as an individual, but as a symbol of what human security contractors represent within this region." "That reputation carries risk as well as benefit," I said. "The more attention drawn towards Sysvaneth's court, the more scrutiny House Thren faces from their own allies and rivals, which could push them toward more desperate measures rather than quiet retreat." "That risk already exists regardless of attention," Illyra said. "House Thren invested too heavily in this plan to simply walk away without attempting some form of recovery, whether through further aggression or through careful political maneuvering designed to rebuild their damaged position." She proved correct within the following month. House Thren, rather than escalating toward further direct confrontation, shifted their approach entirely, focusing instead on rebuilding alliances among neighboring factions who had grown suspicious of their motives following the assassination attempt's exposure. It was a slower, more patient strategy, one that suggested their leadership understood direct confrontation with Sysvaneth's court, now visibly protected by defenses far more sophisticated than previously assumed, carried too much risk to justify continued pursuit. This shift did not mean the danger had disappeared entirely. It simply meant the nature of the threat had changed, moving from immediate physical danger toward longer-term political maneuvering that would require different tools and different patience to counter effectively. Sysvaneth adapted to this new reality with a confidence that continued to develop throughout those weeks, drawing on lessons learned from the assassination attempt to reshape how she approached the remaining challenges facing her fragile empire. She began cultivating stronger relationships with neighboring rulers who had previously remained neutral or cautiously distant, using the demonstrated strength of her security arrangements as evidence that alliance with her court carried genuine value rather than simply additional risk. I found myself, during this period, increasingly consulted not simply as a bodyguard, but as an advisor on matters of security and strategy more broadly. Sysvaneth began including me in discussions that extended well beyond simple physical protection, recognizing that the same patient, strategic thinking that had ended the assassination attempt could be applied to challenges far beyond individual threats against her life. "I have been thinking," she said to me one evening, during one of these expanded discussions, "about what happens beyond my own reign, about what kind of legacy I am building for whoever eventually succeeds me on this throne." "That is a question worth considering carefully," I said. "Though I suspect you already have some direction in mind, given how thoughtfully you have approached every decision since the assassination attempt. I want to build something more resilient than simply avoiding immediate threats," she said. "I want my court to understand, fully and completely, that surviving in this galaxy requires the same patience and strategic thinking you demonstrated that night. Not simply reacting to danger as it arrives, but anticipating it, understanding it, and building defenses that account for threats we cannot yet fully see." I considered her words carefully before responding. "That kind of thinking cannot be taught quickly," I said. "It develops through experience, through mistakes, through the slow accumulation of understanding about how danger actually operates, rather than how tradition assumes it operates." "Then perhaps," she said, "it is time to begin building that understanding more deliberately within my court, rather than relying entirely on a single guard to provide it during moments of crisis." That conversation marked the beginning of changes that would reshape Sysvaneth's approach to governance, far beyond simple personal security. Over the following months, she began establishing training programs within her military command structure that incorporated lessons drawn from human strategic thinking, adapting concepts of patience, misdirection, and psychological preparation into frameworks her own officers could understand and apply within their traditional combat training. It was not a perfect transformation. Many within her court remained skeptical of approaches that seemed to abandon centuries of established Zeltari military tradition. But slowly, incrementally, the culture surrounding her palace's security began shifting towards something more adaptable, more willing to question assumptions that had previously gone unchallenged, simply because tradition demanded their continued acceptance. Throughout this period of transformation, I remained close to Sisvaneth, continuing my primary duty as her personal guard, while also serving in this expanded advisory role that had developed naturally from the trust built during the assassination attempt's aftermath. It was strange, in some ways, to watch an alien empire slowly begin absorbing lessons drawn from human experience, lessons born from a history of struggle and survival on a world millions of light years from this palace. But it also felt, in a way I had not expected when I first accepted this contract 3 years earlier, like something genuinely meaningful was taking shape. Not simply the survival of a single ruler, though that mattered deeply in its own right, but the beginning of something larger, a slow, gradual shift in how an entire region of the galaxy understood danger, preparation, and the strange, unpredictable value that humanity brought to conversations we had only recently been invited to join. 3 months after the failed assassination attempt, Vesh remained within the palace, though her circumstances had changed considerably from those first tense hours in the interrogation chamber beneath the throne room. What began as a captured enemy slowly transformed, through careful negotiation and mutual necessity, into something closer to a reluctant ally. The arrangement had not been my idea initially. Svaneth had proposed it during one of our late evening discussions, suggesting that someone with Vesh's particular skills and knowledge of the Void Reaper Order might prove valuable in identifying future threats before they fully materialized. I had been skeptical at first, uncertain whether an assassin who had come so close to succeeding could ever be trusted with continued access to the palace, regardless of how thoroughly her cooperation had been secured. But Vesh herself had approached the arrangement with the same careful, analytical precision she brought to every aspect of her profession. She understood, perhaps better than anyone else within the palace walls, exactly how close she had come to completing her original contract, and exactly how thoroughly that failure had reshaped her standing within the order that had trained her since childhood. The Void Reapers do not forgive failure easily, she told me during one of our regular meetings, sessions where she provided ongoing intelligence about patterns and methods used by other operatives within her former order. A contract this significant, failed this completely, marks me as compromised in their eyes. Returning to my former life carries its own dangers now, regardless of what happens within these walls. So your cooperation is partly self-preservation, I said, not as an accusation, simply as an observation worth acknowledging openly between us. Self-preservation and genuine reassessment are not mutually exclusive, she said. I have spent months now watching how you operate, how patiently you think, how completely you disregard assumptions that seemed unbreakable when I first accepted this contract. It has given me considerable reason to reconsider certain aspects of my previous profession. Her continued presence within the palace proved valuable in ways I had not fully anticipated when Sisvaneth first proposed the arrangement. Vesh's knowledge of Void Reaper methodology helped identify 2 additional threats during those following months, both intercepted before they could develop into anything resembling the danger her own contract had once represented. The first involved a lesser operative, less skilled than Vesh herself, attempting a much more direct approach against one of Sisvaneth's newly cultivated allies among the neighboring systems. Vesh recognized the pattern immediately from intercepted communications her former contacts inadvertently exposed during routine intelligence gathering, allowing us to warn the targeted ally in time to prevent any actual confrontation. The second, more complicated situation involved an attempt to poison Svaneth's water supply through a servant who had been quietly compromised over several weeks by an intermediary connected to House Thren's continued efforts to weaken her position. This threat proved considerably more subtle than the initial assassination attempt, requiring weeks of careful investigation before we identified the compromised servant and traced the connection back to House Thren's ongoing campaign against Svaneth's throne. They have not given up, Sisvaneth observed. Once this second threat had been fully neutralized, the compromised servant quietly removed, and the poisoning attempt prevented before any harm occurred, simply adapted their approach towards something less obviously connected to their previous failure. That is precisely what I expected, I said. Patience works both ways in situations like this. They understand direct confrontation carries too much risk now, so they shift towards slower, more deniable methods instead. "And how do we counter patience with patience of our own?" she asked. "The same way we countered it the first time," I said. "By understanding exactly how our opponents think and building our defenses around assumptions they have not yet learned to expect." This ongoing pattern, threats emerging and being carefully countered through patient investigation rather than reactive panic, continued throughout the following months, gradually reshaping how Sasvaneth's court approached security at every level. The lessons learned from that first assassination attempt had rippled outward, influencing not simply how individual threats were handled, but how the entire culture surrounding her palace's protection had fundamentally shifted. Vesh, for her part, seemed to find genuine purpose within this new arrangement, her skills applied toward preventing exactly the kind of violence she had once been trained to deliver. It was an unusual transformation, one that surprised even me at times, watching someone who had come so close to ending Svaneth's life gradually become one of the more valuable assets within her ongoing security. "Do you ever regret accepting that original contract?" I asked her once, during a quiet moment between the various threats we continued monitoring together. She considered the question for a long time before answering. "Regret assumes a version of myself that could have known then what I understand now," she said finally. "I do not believe in that kind of regret, but I do believe that failure sometimes reveals paths that success would have permanently closed." I understood exactly what she meant, because my own path toward this palace, toward this strange life protecting an alien queen, light years from the world where I was born, had been shaped by circumstances I could never have fully anticipated when I first left Aldrin's Reach, searching for opportunities beyond the mining tunnels that had defined my early life. 6 months after the initial assassination attempt, House Thren's ambitions finally collapsed entirely, though not through any single dramatic confrontation. Their patient campaign of political maneuvering and subtle sabotage had gradually alienated too many of their remaining allies, who grew increasingly wary of associating with a faction whose reputation had been so thoroughly damaged by the exposed assassination attempt months earlier. Their leadership, facing mounting pressure from within their own ranks and diminishing support among neighboring factions, eventually offered a formal, if carefully worded acknowledgement of wrongdoing, accompanied by significant concessions designed to repair relationships they had damaged throughout their failed campaign. Sasvaneth accepted these concessions with the same careful, strategic thinking that had defined her approach throughout the entire crisis, understanding that complete destruction of House Thren's influence would create its own dangerous power vacuum among the remaining factions along her southern border. "There is wisdom in allowing a defeated enemy some path toward recovery," she told me, once the formal negotiations had concluded. "Complete destruction creates chaos that often proves more dangerous than the original threat itself." "A lesson learned from experience or from careful study?" I asked. "Both," she said, allowing herself a small, tired smile. "Though I suspect you already understood that particular lesson long before I did." A full year had passed since the night Vesh's blade first touched Sasvaneth's throat, and the changes that single night had set into motion continued rippling outward across the wider region in ways none of us had fully anticipated when the crisis first began. Illyra brought new reports to my attention regularly during this period, tracking not simply the political fallout surrounding House Thren's diminished influence, but the broader shift occurring across the galaxy's understanding of human contractors within positions of trust and protection. What had once been considered a curious novelty, a small, unpredictable species occasionally hired for security roles other guards found too dangerous to accept, had transformed into something the galaxy's established powers could no longer afford to dismiss. 7 regional governments have now formally established diplomatic channels specifically for recruiting human security contractors, Illyra told me one afternoon, reviewing a lengthy report gathered from her network's contacts across several neighboring systems. 3 additional monarchies have expressed interest in similar arrangements, though negotiations remain in early stages. "That is a significant shift from a year ago," I said, considering the implications carefully. "It is more than significant," she said. It represents a fundamental change in how this region of the galaxy views humanity's role within the broader community of civilizations. You are no longer simply a curiosity. You have become, in the span of a single year, something closer to a necessity for rulers who understand exactly how dangerous their positions have become. I understood the weight of what she was describing, though the full implications took time to settle properly within my own understanding. Humanity had arrived among the stars only a few short years earlier, small and largely unknown, viewed with a mixture of curiosity and cautious dismissal by civilizations that had existed for millennia before our own arrival. The idea that our species could reshape something as fundamental as galactic security culture within such a brief period felt, even now, difficult to fully comprehend. But the evidence continued accumulating regardless of how difficult it felt to accept. More human contractors were being recruited across the region than ever before, not simply as guards but increasingly as advisors, strategists, and specialists in exactly the kind of unconventional thinking that had ended House Thren's ambitions so thoroughly. Some of my fellow humans, contractors I had known distantly through the loose networks that connected us across various assignments throughout the region, began reaching out directly, seeking advice about navigating this rapidly expanding demand for our particular skills. I found myself, somewhat unexpectedly, becoming something of an informal mentor to several younger contractors just beginning their own careers, protecting alien rulers who had grown increasingly desperate for the kind of security human guards seemed uniquely capable of providing. "They ask me constantly how you managed to build that trap," one contractor, a woman named Grace Ashford who had recently accepted a position protecting a minor noble along a neighboring trade route, told me during one of these conversations. "How you knew exactly how the assassin would think, exactly what gaps she would trust." Voy did not know with absolute certainty, I told her honestly. I understood patterns, based on everything available about how Void Reapers typically operated. Certainty is rarely available in this kind of work. Preparation and patience matter more than certainty ever could. "That distinction seems important," she said thoughtfully. "It is the most important distinction in this entire profession," I said. "Anyone claiming absolute certainty about how a threat will unfold is either lying or has not yet encountered a threat capable of proving them wrong." Svaneth's empire itself had grown noticeably more stable throughout this year of transformation. The internal fractures that had once threatened to tear her fragile rule apart, gradually healing as her court adapted to the more resilient, adaptable culture of security and strategic thinking that had developed since the assassination attempt. Neighboring factions who had once viewed her as an easy target for exploitation now approached her court with considerably more caution, understanding that whatever vulnerabilities might have existed a year earlier had since been thoroughly addressed. This shift did not mean every danger had disappeared entirely. Rulers across the galaxy, regardless of how well protected they became, remained targets for those who coveted their power or resented their influence. But the nature of the threats Svaneth's court now faced had shifted considerably, moving away from direct assassination attempts toward more conventional diplomatic and economic competition, the kind of challenges her court had grown increasingly skilled at navigating. I remained by her side throughout this entire year of transformation, watching her grow from an uncertain young monarch struggling to maintain control over a shrinking empire into someone considerably more confident, more strategically minded, more capable of anticipating challenges before they fully materialized into genuine crises. "You have changed considerably since that first year I hired you," she observed one evening, as we walked together through gardens that had been carefully expanded and restored throughout the palace's recent period of stability. "Though perhaps changed is not the correct word, perhaps revealed is more accurate." "What do you mean?" I asked. "When I first hired you, I understood intellectually that you possessed capabilities beyond what my previous guards could offer," she said. "But I do not think I truly understood the full depth of that capability until circumstances forced it fully into view. You have not changed, Daniel. You have simply been given increasing opportunity to demonstrate exactly what you were always capable of providing." I considered her observation carefully, recognizing truth within it that extended beyond simply my own personal experience. "Perhaps that is true for humanity more broadly as well," I said. We did not change when we arrived among the stars. We simply began revealing capabilities that had always existed, shaped by circumstances on a world very different from any other civilization currently represented across this region. A dangerous kind of revelation, for those who once considered your species easily dismissed, she said. Dangerous only for those who built their ambitions around assumptions that no longer hold true, I said. For those willing to adapt, to understand exactly what humanity actually represents, rather than what assumptions once suggested, the revelation offers considerably more opportunity than danger. She was quiet for a long moment, considering that distinction carefully, before finally speaking again. I count myself fortunate, she said, to have recognized that opportunity early enough to benefit from it, rather than discovering it too late, the way House Thren eventually did. We continued walking in comfortable silence for a while longer, the gardens around us quiet and peaceful in a way that would have felt impossible during those tense early months following the assassination attempt. It was a strange kind of victory, not simply surviving a single dangerous night, but watching an entire empire gradually transform into something more resilient, more thoughtful, more capable of navigating the genuine dangers that came with existing among the stars. There will be more challenges ahead, Sesvaneth said eventually, breaking the comfortable silence between us. House Thren's failure does not mean every threat to my throne has permanently disappeared. New ambitions will emerge, new rivals will test whatever defenses we have built, and eventually, something will arrive that we have not yet learned to properly anticipate. That is likely true, I agreed. No defense remains permanently sufficient against every possible future threat. The galaxy continues changing, and whatever prepared us for yesterday's dangers may prove insufficient against tomorrow's. Does that reality trouble you? She asked. I considered the question honestly before answering. It would trouble me more, I said, if I believed preparation itself was pointless, simply because certainty remains impossible. Preparation does not require guaranteeing every future outcome. It requires building the kind of adaptable, patient thinking capable of meeting whatever eventually arrives, regardless of its specific shape. She nodded slowly, absorbing that perspective with the same careful consideration she now applied to nearly every significant conversation within her court. Then perhaps, she said, the true lesson from everything that has happened this past year is not that we have permanently secured my throne against every possible danger, but that we have built something considerably more valuable, an entire culture capable of meeting whatever comes next with the same patience and preparation that ended House Thren's ambitions so thoroughly. That seems like the most accurate way to understand everything that has happened, I said. We reached the edge of the gardens where they overlooked the wider palace grounds, the evening light casting long shadows across courtyards that had once felt considerably more dangerous than they did now. Sisvaneth stood quietly for a long moment, taking in the view with an expression that carried both satisfaction and the particular weariness that comes from carrying genuine responsibility for an entire empire's continued survival. I am grateful, she said finally, turning to face me directly, not simply for surviving that night, but for everything that survival eventually allowed my court to become. I do not believe I would have understood the true depth of the challenges surrounding my throne, or the true depth of the resilience required to meet them, without everything that unfolded over this past year. Gratitude is not necessary, I said. This has always been my responsibility, from the very first day you hired me. Perhaps, she said, but responsibility fulfilled this thoroughly, this thoughtfully, deserves acknowledgement regardless of whether it was originally required by contract. I did not argue the point further, recognizing that some moments called for simple acceptance rather than continued deflection. Instead, I simply nodded, acknowledging her words with the same quiet respect that had defined our working relationship since that very first conversation in her office 3 years earlier. The final test of everything Sisvaneth's court had rebuilt over that transformative year arrived without warning, exactly the way genuine tests of preparation always do, on an evening that had begun like any other, quiet and unremarkable, until it suddenly was not. A diplomatic gathering had been arranged within the palace, bringing together representatives from several neighboring systems who had grown increasingly interested in formalizing alliances with Sesvaneth's now considerably more stable throne. The gathering itself represented months of careful negotiation, an important step toward the broader stability she had been working to establish throughout the region. I stood near the edges of the main hall that evening, watching the gathered representatives with the same careful attention I applied to every significant event within the palace, regardless of how routine such gatherings had become over recent months. Vesh stood nearby as well, her presence within these gatherings no longer drawing the suspicious glances it once had, her ongoing contributions to palace security having earned her a cautious but genuine acceptance among those who understood her transformed role. It was Vesh who noticed the irregularity first, a subtle shift in the behavior of one representative's attendant, someone positioned slightly too close to the main gathering, moving with a controlled precision that did not match the casual demeanor of a typical diplomatic aide. "Daniel," she said quietly, her voice carrying the particular tension I had learned to recognize from our months of working together. The attendant near the eastern entrance. "Something is wrong." I followed her gaze subtly, careful not to draw attention that might alert whoever was watching, for exactly that kind of reaction. The attendant she indicated stood near a representative from a system along the outer trade routes, someone whose alliance Svaneth had been particularly eager to secure, given their strategic position controlling several important resource corridors. "You recognize something specific," I said, keeping my voice equally quiet. "Posture," she said, "the way they hold their weight, the positioning relative to the exit routes. It matches training patterns I recognize, though not from the Void Reapers specifically. A different order, one that operates with similar methodology, but different specific techniques." This was new information, a threat operating outside the patterns we had spent the past year learning to anticipate. I felt the familiar sharpening of focus that came whenever genuine danger revealed itself. The same clarity that had guided me through that first confrontation over a year earlier. "We cannot act directly without more certainty," I said. "A mistaken accusation against a diplomatic attendant during a gathering this significant would damage the very alliances Svaneth has worked to build." "Then what do you suggest?" Vesh asked. "We watch and we prepare," I said. "The same approach that worked before. Let them believe their opportunity remains available, while we quietly close every path they might use to act on it." Over the following hour, we worked carefully to shift the gathering's dynamics without drawing obvious attention, gradually repositioning palace guards to cover angles the suspicious attendant had likely identified as vulnerable, while I moved closer to Svaneth's position without appearing to change my normal patrol pattern significantly. The moment came exactly as gatherings like this always seem to produce their moments of genuine danger, during a transition between formal proceedings, when attention across the room naturally scattered as representatives moved between different conversation groups and refreshment areas. The attendant moved with sudden, controlled speed towards Svaneth's position, closing the distance far faster than the casual pace expected of diplomatic staff. I was already moving before the intent became fully clear to anyone else in the room, my months of heightened awareness translating instantly into decisive action. I intercepted the attendant several steps before they could reach striking distance of Svaneth, using controlled, precise movement that avoided causing serious harm, while completely neutralizing whatever weapon they had concealed beneath their formal attire. The confrontation lasted only seconds, ending with the attendant secured and disarmed, before most of the gathered representatives had even fully registered that anything unusual had occurred. Vesh moved quickly to help contain the situation, her own training proving valuable in quickly identifying whether the attendant carried any additional concealed threats or whether accomplices might be positioned elsewhere within the gathering. "Clear," she confirmed after a rapid assessment. "This appears to have been an isolated attempt, not part of a larger coordinated action." Svaneth, though visibly shaken by how close the danger had come to her position, maintained remarkable composure throughout the immediate aftermath, quickly working with her advisors to manage the diplomatic implications of an attempted attack occurring during such a significant gathering. The representative whose attendant had attempted the attack proved genuinely shocked and cooperative, quickly confirming that the individual had only recently joined their staff through channels that would require careful investigation. Later that evening, Once the gathering had concluded and the immediate crisis had been properly contained, Sisvaneth and I sat together in her private chambers, reviewing everything that had unfolded during those tense final moments of the diplomatic event. "A year ago," she said quietly, "an attack like that would have ended very differently. I would have been considerably less prepared, considerably more vulnerable, and the outcome would likely have been catastrophic for everything we have worked to build. But it did not end that way," I said, "because everything we built over this past year prepared us for exactly this kind of moment, even one arriving from a direction we had not specifically anticipated. You saw the danger before anyone else in that room understood what was happening," she said, "just as you did that first night, over a year ago." "Vesh saw it first, this time," I said, glancing toward where the former assassin stood quietly near the chamber entrance, her expression carrying the same careful, focused attention that had become characteristic of her role within the palace's ongoing security. Preparation is rarely the work of a single individual. It requires an entire culture capable of recognizing danger from multiple angles, multiple perspectives, multiple kinds of experience, brought together toward a shared purpose. Vesh acknowledged this observation with a small, measured nod, though I could see something like genuine satisfaction beneath her typically controlled expression, the particular satisfaction that comes from watching your own transformed purpose contribute meaningfully toward protecting something worth protecting. Svaneth studied the two of us for a long moment, something thoughtful and quietly amazed passing behind her expression. "A year ago," she said, "I hired a bodyguard because I needed someone willing to break rules others considered unbreakable. Tonight, I watched that same guard, working alongside the very assassin who once nearly ended my life, protect me from a threat neither of them had specifically anticipated, using instincts and preparation built through months of genuine partnership rather than simple contractual obligation. Sometimes the paths that lead toward genuine security look nothing like what anyone expects when the journey first begins." She allowed herself a tired but genuine smile, the particular expression of someone who had survived considerably more than most rulers ever face, and had grown stronger, wiser, and more capable because of it, rather than despite it. In the weeks that followed the diplomatic gathering and its unexpected moment of danger, the wider consequences of what had happened continued to unfold across the region in ways that reached far beyond Sisvaneth's own throne. The representative whose attendant had attempted the attack cooperated fully with the resulting investigation, and the trail eventually led to yet another faction, smaller and less influential than House Thren had been, but similarly interested in the instability that Sisvaneth's death or incapacitation might have created among the shifting alliances of the region. This new discovery did not surprise me, nor did it surprise Sisvaneth. We had both come to understand, over the past year, that a ruler occupying a position of growing influence would always attract ambitious rivals seeking to exploit any perceived vulnerability. The difference now was that such attempts were increasingly likely to fail, caught and neutralized long before they could achieve their intended purpose, thanks to the culture of patient, adaptable preparation that had taken root throughout her court. Word of this second failed attempt spread even faster than the first had, in part because it occurred during a significant diplomatic gathering witnessed by representatives from multiple neighboring systems, each of whom carried their own account of what they had seen back to their respective courts. The story that emerged this time carried a different weight than the first, no longer describing an isolated incident of unusual human capability, but confirming a pattern, a demonstrated, repeatable reality that Sisvaneth's court had become one of the most difficult targets in the entire region to successfully threaten. I received, during this period, several formal inquiries from other rulers seeking to understand exactly how such a transformation had been achieved, whether it could be replicated within their own security arrangements, and whether contractors with capabilities similar to mine might be available for their own courts. Some of these inquiries I answered honestly, explaining the general principles involved without revealing specific tactical details that might compromise Svaneth's continued security. Others I redirected toward the growing network of human contractors now operating across the region, individuals like Grace Ashford, and several others who had begun building their own reputations within courts, eager for the particular blend of patience, unconventional thinking, and complete disregard for traditional limitations that human guards seemed uniquely capable of providing. Sisvaneth herself began receiving increased diplomatic attention during this period, no longer viewed as a vulnerable young monarch struggling to maintain a shrinking empire, but as a ruler who had successfully navigated multiple serious threats to emerge stronger and more stable than before. Alliances that had once seemed impossible to secure suddenly became available, as neighboring factions recognized the genuine value of associating with a court that had demonstrated such remarkable resilience. It was during one particular evening, several months after the diplomatic gathering incident, that Sisvaneth raised a question that had apparently been developing in her mind for some time, one that connected directly back to everything we had experienced together since that first tense confrontation over a year and a half earlier. We sat together in her private study, a quieter, more intimate space than the grand chambers used for formal court business, reviewing reports about the continued stabilization of relationships along her southern border. The evening had grown late, the palace around us settling into the particular quiet that comes after the day's official business has concluded, but before the deeper stillness of night fully arrives. "I have been thinking," she said, setting aside the report she had been reviewing, "about something you said, long ago, during our very first conversation, when I first considered hiring you." "What specifically?" I asked. "You told me that trust could not be proven through words alone," she said, "that it could only be demonstrated through action, through being the person who stood between danger and everything worth protecting. I have thought about that principle many times since then, watching it prove true again and again, throughout everything we have experienced together." "It has held true," I agreed, "though I suspect you are working toward a different point than simply revisiting that original conversation." She smiled slightly, acknowledging that I had correctly anticipated something beneath her words. "I have been wondering," she said, choosing her words carefully, "what would happen if circumstances required something different from you, not protection in the traditional sense, but something closer to what nearly happened to me that first night. If I ever needed someone capable of delivering exactly the kind of quiet, controlled danger that Vesh once brought into this very palace, someone capable of being the whisper in the dark rather than the guard standing against it." The question hung in the air between us for a long moment, carrying weight that extended well beyond simple curiosity. It touched on something we had both understood, perhaps without ever fully articulating it, since that very first confrontation. The same capabilities that had allowed me to protect her so completely could, under different circumstances, be turned toward entirely different purposes. I considered my answer carefully before speaking, because the question deserved genuine reflection rather than a casual dismissal. The line between protector and threat has always been thinner than most people assume, I said finally. Every capability I used to protect you that first night, the patience, the willingness to disregard traditional limitations, the careful construction of circumstances that appear natural while actually being deliberately shaped, all of it could be turned toward opposite purposes under different circumstances. "Does that possibility trouble you?" she asked. "It should trouble anyone who possesses that kind of capability," I said, "which is precisely why the choice of how to use it matters more than the capability itself. I have chosen, since accepting this contract, to use everything I am capable of toward protecting rather than threatening." That choice does not become less relevant simply because circumstances might someday require something different. Sisvaneth studied me for a long moment, something complicated passing behind her expression, curiosity mixed with a particular kind of respect that had developed gradually over our years working together. "If I ever needed you to become that whisper," she said quietly, "rather than the guard who stops it, would you be capable of making that choice?" I let the question settle for a moment before answering, allowing the same small, knowing smile that had first appeared during that tense confrontation over a year earlier to return now, quieter but unmistakably present. "I have spent my entire life learning that survival sometimes requires becoming exactly what circumstances demand, regardless of how uncomfortable that transformation might feel. I said. If protecting you, or protecting everything your throne now represents to this entire region, ever required me to become the whisper rather than the guard who prevents it, I would make that choice without hesitation. Something in her expression shifted at that answer, not fear exactly, but a deeper, more complete understanding of exactly what she had brought into her court those years ago, when she first decided that traditional guards were no longer sufficient protection against the dangers surrounding her fragile throne. That is precisely why the galaxy finds your species so unsettling, she said quietly. Not because you are inherently dangerous, though you certainly can be when circumstances demand it, but because you approach that danger with such complete, unwavering clarity about when and how to use it. Most species build elaborate traditions and rules around violence specifically because they fear what happens without those boundaries. Your species seems to carry that same capability without needing the boundaries at all, relying instead on judgment, purpose, and choice. Judgment can fail, I said. Purpose can be misused. We are not infallible simply because we lack the traditional boundaries other species rely upon. But when that judgment holds true, when that purpose remains aligned with protecting rather than destroying, the results can accomplish things that traditional boundaries would never allow. She nodded slowly, absorbing that distinction with the same careful consideration she had applied to nearly every significant lesson learned throughout our years working together. I think, she said finally, that is precisely why so many rulers across this region have begun seeking exactly what I found in you 3 years ago. Not simply protection, but a fundamentally different way of understanding what protection actually requires. We sat together in comfortable silence for a while longer, the late evening settling fully into night around us, the palace quiet except for the distant sounds of guards completing their routine patrols that now incorporated the patient, adaptable principles that had reshaped this court's entire approach to security since that first fateful night. The galaxy has begun calling it a nightmare, Sesvaneth said eventually, breaking the comfortable silence between us. Rival factions whisper about the growing presence of human contractors across the region, describing it as though something dangerous and uncontrollable has been unleashed among the established powers that have governed this part of the galaxy for centuries. Perhaps it is a nightmare, I said, for those who built their ambitions around assumptions that no longer hold true, for those who understood danger only in the traditional forms their own cultures had taught them to recognize and prepare against. And for the rest of us, she asked, for those who choose partnership rather than opposition. I considered the question for a long moment, thinking back over everything that had unfolded since that tense confrontation behind her throne, the patient months of preparation, the careful trust built gradually between former enemies, the wider transformation rippling outward across an entire region of the galaxy that had once considered humanity small and insignificant. For the rest of us, I said finally, perhaps it is simply the beginning of understanding what genuine partnership actually requires. Not comfort, not certainty, but patience, adaptability, and the willingness to trust capabilities that do not match traditional expectations. Because those capabilities, properly directed, can accomplish protection that traditional approaches never could. Sesvaneth studied me for a long moment in the quiet evening light of her private study, something settled and confident in her expression that had not existed during those early tense months following the assassination attempt. Whatever nightmare the galaxy's rival factions imagined humanity represented, she understood now, with complete clarity, that the same capability could just as easily represent something far more valuable, a partner capable of navigating dangers that traditional approaches had never fully prepared anyone to face. 3 years ago, she said quietly, I asked you a question in my private office, wondering why I should trust a stranger from a species my people barely understood. You told me trust could only be proven through action, through being the one who stood between danger and everything worth protecting. I remember, I said. I think, she said, I finally understand the full weight of what that promise actually meant. I allowed the same quiet, knowing smile to return once more, the expression that had first appeared behind her throne during that tense confrontation so long ago, the smile that had unsettled an assassin who believed she held complete control over a situation that had actually been shaped entirely around her own careful expectations. Then perhaps, I said, the nightmare the galaxy fears is simply this: somewhere among the stars, a species once considered small and insignificant learned exactly how to become the quiet, patient certainty standing between danger and everything worth protecting. And once that certainty exists, once it has proven itself capable of ending threats that seemed impossible to overcome, there is no version of the galaxy that returns to how things existed before. Sesvaneth held my gaze for a long moment, understanding fully now, completely and without reservation, exactly what she had brought into her fragile empire, the day she decided that traditional guards were no longer sufficient protection against a galaxy full of ambitious rivals and patient enemies. Somewhere beyond the walls of that quiet study, across a galaxy still adjusting to humanity's growing presence among the stars, other rulers were beginning to understand the same lesson, one contract at a time, one failed assassination attempt at a time, one quiet, unsettling smile at a time. The galaxy's nightmare, if that was truly what this transformation represented to those who feared it, had only just begun.